In software development, people usually organize their code in three sections, I guess you should call it. There's the UI, the presentation, where the user of your application will input and read data that you're trying to gather from them or show to them to do whatever they want to do. There's the next part of the application, which is typically like the business domain, where that data is passed through, passed into, manipulated, validated, ensures that it's not breaking any requirements for the data to actually exist. For example, for a person to exist in someone's application, a first name might be required, and if it's not present, that business layer will be like, nope, we're not allowing that. The third part is the data persistence mechanism. This is where the information is persisted and stored that is typically gathered from the UI, passed through to the business, and eventually gets to the data persistence mechanism. Like I said, in software, developers and systems are usually thought of and designed and organized in this kind of mindset. Structurally, this is how organizations will typically structure their development teams. They'll think of them in terms of this is the presentation team, this is the business and domain layer team, and then this is the DBAs and database administration team. These are what are called layers. This kind of follows what Conway's law is that the structure of the code mimics the structure, the communication structure of the organization that the code resides in. This is commonly known as the three-layer architecture. There's different variations. You can go up to 4, 5, 6 layers. Some variations I'll show you on the side over here. There's actually a 2-layer architecture too that sometimes development teams follow. Like I was saying, conceptually this makes sense to organize how you would think about your code in this way. But if you actually open your development environment and see that your code is structured this way at the top level, where you have a UI folder, a business/domain folder, and a data folder, for example, then I would say, what is your application actually doing? Unfortunately, at this level, you can't determine what your application is doing, which is not good. I mean, you can click into the top folder and maybe you'll see something like company directory, and then you'll know what the application is doing, but you had to dig in to the folder structure itself at the top level to know what the actual application is and should be doing, which is not correct. Let's apply this structural organization to something day-to-day like reading a book. When you read a book, you don't think, I'm going to read a book, and that book is named Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You think, I'm going to read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book. The medium is the book. You don't apply that at the top level. You apply the specific concept as to what the medium is named first. So for the example of the company directory, you don't think presentation layer, I'm going to apply this to a company directory. You think, I have a company directory, and this company directory needs a presentation layer. Let's flesh this out with a more concrete example, like looking up a verse in the Bible. The typical human mind will think, the Bible, collection of books. 1 Corinthians, book. Chapter 13, chapter. Verse 11, verse. The other way sounds funny and not quite right. If I say book collection, Bible, book, 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 11. This is another one of those subtle differences between the digital and physical world. In the digital world, this structure of organizing code makes sense. It's ideal to do it this way. In the physical world, where this structure is going to be consumed and used, it doesn't hold up. I am going to be reading this structure, and the benefit for having this structure is for me to read. Structuring the code in this organization doesn't benefit the actual development and application at the digital level. This is purely for aesthetics for the reader, and unfortunately, it doesn't help. Now, let's revisit the original organization structure that I had at the start. Again, if you look at this, do you know what this application is doing? Do you know its purpose? No, you don't. You have to drill down into one of the top-level folders to see, oh, it's a company directory. Now, let's flip it and do the structure that I'm proposing. Now, at this level, do you know what the application is doing and its purposes? I would say, yeah, you do. Now, if we go into it, what do we see? Oh, we see that the company directory has a presentation, a business, and a data layer. Okay, I think I know what this is doing. Let's ignore my original argument that this coding organization structure is not ideal, and let's approach it from a different perspective. Before I said that organizing your code is not beneficial to the code itself. It doesn't benefit the application. This is purely an aesthetic thing for the developer to read and understand what the application is doing. Let me introduce you to the concept of a tier. Now, you've heard of the 3-tier architecture. Well, that's what we've been looking at for the past couple minutes. A tier is a type of layer that is independently deployable. Think of a tier as an independently running application. So for this 3-tier architecture, the UI tier is an independently deployable application that doesn't need to deploy with the business tier or the data tier. Likewise, the business tier as its own application can be deployed on its own without needing to deploy the UI tier or the data tier. And lastly, the data tier can be changed on its own and deployed on its own without needing to deploy the UI tier or business tier. At first impression, this appears to be a good structure. I mean, the UI has its own requirements and responsibilities separate from the business tier, which has its own responsibilities and are unique to itself. And the data tier is just where the data is stored. You don't need any of those requirements or responsibilities in any of the other tiers, so the segmentation makes sense. But nothing is quite as it always appears. Assume our company directory has this page as the UI for its employee. And now let's assume that the employees all now get a work phone. The current UI doesn't have that concept of a work phone number. So if another employee wants to call another employee, the intention is that they can access the company directory for that employee, look up their phone number, and then call them. That's the requirement that we're adding to this company directory now. Like I was saying, the current UI doesn't show the employee phone number in this page, so let's add it. All right, we add it, so now it says the employee phone number, and we just need to display it by retrieving the value from the business layer, and the business layer doesn't have that concept in it yet, so I can't do this. I can't complete this requirement yet. Now let's go to the business tier and add the concept of the employee phone number to the response of the API that the UI is consuming. All right, so added the employee phone number to the response, so that should now feed into the UI. The UI will display that, and currently right now the business layer has that employee phone number to be set to nothing. Well, okay, I need to set that to the response from the database that I got the employee from, so all right, so the employee.phone number, and the database doesn't have that represented in there. All right, well, that's okay. We'll now jump to the database tier, and okay, here's the employee table. The employee table has first name, last name, doesn't have the employee phone number. Okay, let me add the column employee phone number. Okay, let me add the phone number for that employee. Okay, so now I can retrieve that value for the business tier, and the business tier will now set that value in its response to the UI, and the UI will now actually show that value. Awesome. All right, we did it. Good job. One foundation of layering, no pun intended, is that each layer depends on the layer directly underneath it. So the presentation UI layer depends on the business layer. It needs the business layer data to be transported, or the UI will send data to that business layer for the functionality to be completed. Likewise, the business layer needs to get data and send data to the persistent layer to persist it or pull it out. Let's revisit what I just did again. So I needed to add the requirement to display the employee phone number in the UI. So the first step I wanted to do was the UI needed to have a new label that says employee phone number and show the employee phone number. I get that done and display that phone number, but the API response from the business layer didn't actually have an employee phone number. So if I wanted to deploy the UI tier independently, it would blow up because there's no reference for an employee phone number in the API response. So I can't do that. So now I had to jump to the business tier. The business tier, all right, let me add the employee phone number to the API response. Okay, now it's added, and in order to actually set that value because it's null, I need to get that from the database. So let me get that from the record that's retrieved from the database, and oh, that doesn't have an employee phone number either. So yeah, I can't deploy the business tier in isolation as well independently from the UI because the functionality is still not working as is. The user will still see an exception because the API is returning a wrong value. So now we have to jump back into the data tier and add that employee phone number. And in adding that employee phone number, everything's now working through and it's working correctly. But the problem is I can't deploy any of these layers/tiers independently from one another. They're all dependent on each other for this change. So the whole benefit of a tier of independent deployability is completely lost here. The perceived benefit of having this 3-tier architecture was unfortunately incorrect, as demonstrated by showing that any new functionality change in the system required all the tiers to be changed all at once. You also have the extra overhead of, instead of managing just one single application, you now have to manage 3 different applications without any benefit to having 3 applications running at once. Again, the 3 applications are the tiers of the UI, the business, and the data. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion that a requirement change will require all layers to be modified for that functionality to work. So I'm strongly advocating for that when you start a new application, do not structure your code to be in a 3-tier or n-tier architecture where n is more than 3, because this will not help you in the start. It may in the long run, but definitely don't do this in the start. So we just debunked that organizing your code in this structure because you think there might be benefit for it being a 3-tier architecture would be helpful, which we found it wasn't. And we also found that from the reader's perspective, reading the organization structure of this code doesn't give the reader any indication as to what this application is doing. I think it's safe to say that this structure should not be used. It just makes sense for the top-level concept to be called the business name that groups this functionality together. A domain, the company directory. It reads very clearly to the consumer, the developer, for this code to be like, this is for the company directory. And from a deployability perspective, the company directory folder seems to be an independently deployable thing. And within that independently deployable thing, this domain, you see that there's a UI layer, a business layer, and a data layer. We could call this thing a microservice. In all seriousness, please don't call this a microservice. I don't want you to prematurely create a microservice on your own. That video that I talked about interfaces and abstractions coming about too early, well, the same thing applies here. You can apply a microservice too early and bad things can happen. In summary, layering is just an implementation detail as to how to organize your code. It shouldn't bleed anywhere outside of your current code base you're developing in. So, no tiers, And it should be readable to any consumer of the code, which would be a developer. They should be able to look at it and know what this application is doing by the top level structure of the coding organization. But hey, this is just my strongly held opinion, weakly held, of course. So leave a comment in the section below and let's discuss.